If you ever heard Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22 quoted, "Wives, submit to your husbands," there's a very high chance you heard it used to justify a rigid, one-sided power dynamic. It is one of the most frequently weaponized and misunderstood verses in the entire Bible. But if we look at the original language and trace the theology back to its roots, we discover that Paul was not giving men a license to control their wives. He was doing something far more radical. He was showing them how to undo the curse of the fall. To see what is really going on, we have to start with a piece of grammar that changes everything. In the original Greek text, the word submit does not actually appear in verse 22. It is not there. A literal translation flows seamlessly from verse 21 straight into verse 22. Verse 21 says, "Submitting to one another in the fear of God." And verse 22 simply continues, "Wives, to your own husbands as to the Lord." The translators of our modern Bibles borrow the verb submit from the sentence before it just to make the English readable. Why does this matter? Because you cannot isolate verse 22 from verse 21. Paul establishes a baseline rule that applies to everyone first. Mutual submission. Before anyone is told to lead or follow, everyone is commanded to serve one another. To understand why this text was so revolutionary, we have to look at the three-part story the Bible tells about relationships: the design, the fracture, and the redemption. Part 1 begins in Genesis chapter 2. God creates man and woman in perfect equality, unity, and partnership. When Adam first sees Eve, he does not claim authority over her. He celebrates her. "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Genesis tells us they become one flesh. There's no hierarchy, no power struggle, no fear, only unhindered partnership. Then comes part 2, the fall. Sin comes the world, and human hearts become broken. In Genesis 3:16, God describes the tragic consequence, telling the woman, "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Read that carefully. Domination, control, and the struggle for power were never part of God's original design. They were symptoms of the curse. The human drive to rule over another person entered the world only after things went wrong. Which brings us to part 3, Ephesians 5. Paul is writing into a first-century Roman culture where men held near absolute legal power over their households. Culturally, men were ruling over their wives, exactly as Genesis predicted they would. But Paul does not validate that cultural power. Instead, he turns to the husbands and gives them 3 times as much instruction as he gives the wives. He commands them to set their culture dominance aside. "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loves the church and gave himself for it." Paul tells the person who holds all the social power to willingly lay down in sacrificial love, to look at his wife the way Adam looked at Eve in Genesis 2. not as a subject to rule, but as his own flesh to cherish and protect. Ephesians 5 does not reinforce the curse of Genesis 3. It cures it. This brings us to verses 23 and 24, where Paul writes, "For the husband is head of the wife, as also Christ is head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything." For centuries, people have read the word head as meaning as commander whose orders must be obeyed. But look at how Christ actually exercises his headship. He does not exercise his authority through coercion. He exercises it by laying down his life to save, protect, and secure his people. But we cannot skip the phrase that makes people the most uneasy: in everything. Read on its own. That phrase can sound like a blank check, as if a husband's word is law, full stops. But Paul never lets that phrase stand on its own. It is bookended on both sides by the standard the husbands held to verse 21st call to mutual submission and verse 25th command to love, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. In everything, it's not permission for a husband to demand whenever he wants, whatever he wants, nor does it require a wife to participate in sin or submit to abuse, because no human authority is ever given permission to contradict the authority of Christ. Rather, it describes the kind of relationship that grows where a husband is already giving himself away in Christ-like love. The scope of her trust is drawn precisely as wide as the depths of his sacrifice. A husband who wants in everything without offering gave himself for it is claiming half of Paul's sentence and discarding the half that makes it safe. To understand a husband's role, it helps look at the word husband itself, which carries the old sense of husbandry, the careful tending and cultivate of a garden. A husband on this practice is not a king demanding compliance. He is a gardener. Gardeners never force growth. They cultivate the conditions where life can flourish. His task is to cultivate, protect, and nourish the home so that his wife can flourish in safety. When the husband steps into that role, loving, sacrificially, protecting emotionally, and providing the kind of security Christ provides for his people, something changes. Submission is no longer something demanded by power. It becomes an expression of trust that can flourish in the safety of sacrificial love. A wife does not yield out of fear or force compliance. He chooses to partner with her husband because she knows she is safe. It is easier to trust someone when you know they will gladly lay down their life for you. When the husband provides that kind of security, the mature response it invites is trust. This brings us to the heart of the passage. Paul writes, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word." Notice too that the washing comes by the word, a word actually spoken, not just water alone. A husband who protects his wife's body but wounds her heart with his word has only picked up half the basin. In the ancient Roman world, a bride was bathed and adorned by her own family before being presented to her husband. Paul turns that custom upside down. He tells the husband that he is the one who holds the basin, the one called to serve, to cleanse, to uplift. He trades a throne for a servant's towel. Why? Verse 27 tells us that he might present her to himself, a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. Think of that through the gardener's eyes. A gardener does not shout at the wilting plant to grow faster. He examines the soil, the water, the light, the environment he is responsible for. Paul makes this explicit in verse 28. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. Call this the mirror test. Just as a healthy garden reflects the faithfulness of its gardener, a wife's flourishing is profoundly shaped by the atmosphere her husband helps create. Cherished and safe, she radiates life, confidence, and peace. Left in an environment of criticism, neglect, or control, she begins to wither, not because she lacks value, but because the garden has not been tended. Paul is telling husbands, your wife's life is a mirror of your leadership. A radiant wife is fed by radiant sacrificial love. Care for her heart with the same instinct you use to care for your own body. Then in verse 31, Paul ties the whole picture back to the beginning of time. For this reason, a man should leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two should become one flesh. Sacrificial love is not a new invention. It is the ultimate fulfillment of the original design. So how does a couple actually work out the brokenness of the fall and back into the beauty of creation? Genesis 2 gives us a three-step framework Paul is pointing back to. First, living, establishing independence. Genesis says a man leaves his father and mother. In the ancient world, it was the woman who left her family for the man's household. God shifts the responsibility onto the man instead. Leaving means stepping out from the primary influence or dependence of your parents to build a new family unit. Second, cleaving, total commitment. Cleave means to be welded, fiercely bonded. It is unbreakable loyalty, choosing your spouse above every other human relationship, building an environment of safety and trust that nothing else can come between. Third, weaving, becoming one flesh. Marriage is the lifelong work of weaving two lives into a single tapestry. Your dreams, your finances, your values, your joys, and your sorrows, thread by thread. Two separate lives become one shared story, one purpose, one direction, one flesh. Let's be honest. This blueprint, mutual submission, unconditional sacrificial love, laying down your ego for another person, sounds beautiful on paper and feels nearly impossible in practice. That's because it is impossible if we are relying on ourselves. Our nature, instinct is to protect ourselves, demand our own way, and keep score. Pursued by sheer willpower, this kind of marriage eventually collapses under the weight of our own selfishness, drifting back toward the power struggles of Genesis 3. This is exactly why Paul anchors the entire passage in the gospel. He He doesn't merely give us a higher standard of marriage. He points us to the new source of life. He does not say, husbands, love your wives because it is a good idea. He says, love your wife, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. The gospel is the only power that makes this kind of love possible. We can only extend the sacrificial love horizontally to our spouse after we have first received God's perfect love vertically through Christ. When we truly grasp that Jesus saw us in our brokenness, loved us at our worst, laid down his life for us, and served us before we even deserved it, something began to change. Pride begins to loosen its grip. The need to win every argument starts to fade. We become free to love because he first loved us. Therefore, we have to be completely honest about this conclusion. This kind of relationship, which runs completely against our fallen human nature, can never be manufactured by willpower alone. It requires a new heart and a power beyond ourselves. If you are not yet a follower of Christ, this passage may not immediately seem like a practical guidebook for everyday marriage, but it reveals something profound. God's design for marriage is not simply a better relationship strategy or a more refined set of rules. It is a picture of transformed hearts. The kind of love Paul described can only grow where people are being transformed by the love of Christ. That is why Christianity is not ultimately about trying harder. It is about becoming new. And when Christ transforms the heart, he begins to restore even our worst broken relationships. So stop letting people use verse 22 to defend a broken narrative. Let's start reading, understanding, and living the whole story. The Bible's blueprint for marriage was never about maintaining a hierarchy of control. It is about a self-sacrificing partnership where two people willingly serve each other, reflecting the very heart of Christ. Perhaps that's why Paul calls marriage a great mystery. It was never merely about husband and wives. It was always been about Christ restoring what sin destroyed. The Bible begins in a garden. Humanity turns the garden into a wilderness of fear, blame, and domination. Christ enters another garden, not to seize power, but to surrender himself to the Father's will. The world said, fight for your rights. Jesus says, lay down your life. The world asks, who has the power? Jesus asks, who will serve? That is the love that reverses the curse. And wherever that love takes root, gardens bloom again.